Growing up on the Henderson family farm in rural Nebraska wasn't easy, but it was all I ever knew. 300 acres of prime farmland stretching as far as the eye could see, with golden wheat fields that danced in the summer breeze and corn that stood tall and proud come harvest time. My father, Thomas Henderson, had worked this land for 40 years, just as his father had before him, and his father before them. 4 generations of Hendersons had called this place home. My brother Jake and I spent our childhood summers running through those fields, learning the rhythm of farm life from dawn to dusk. We'd wake before sunrise to help with chores, feed the livestock, and repair whatever needed fixing. Dad always said farming wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a responsibility to the land and to future generations who would depend on it. Jake was 3 years older than me, and Dad's clear favorite. Where I was thoughtful and methodical, Jake was charismatic and bold. He could charm anyone, from the bank officers who handled our loans to the neighbors who sometimes feuded over property lines. Dad saw himself in Jake's confidence, his ability to make quick decisions and take risks that sometimes paid off handsomely. But I was the one who truly loved the land itself. While Jake talked about modernizing everything and expanding operations, I spent hours walking the fields, understanding the soil conditions, learning which crops thrived where and why. I knew every acre by heart, where the drainage was best, which sections needed lime, where the old oak tree marked the original property boundary that great-grandfather Henderson had established in 1892. When Dad started talking about retirement 5 years ago, I naturally assumed Jake and I would inherit equal shares of the farm. It seemed fair, logical, and in keeping with our family's traditions. The changes started subtly. Jake began spending more time in town, attending what he called business meetings that stretched late into the evening. He'd return home with expensive bottles of whiskey and stories about investment opportunities that could transform our family's future. Dad listened with growing interest as Jake described partnerships with agricultural development companies and schemes to maximize the land's potential value. I noticed Jake started dressing differently too, trading his work boots for polished leather shoes, his faded jeans for crisp khakis, his John Deere cap for no hat at all. When I asked him about it, he laughed it off, saying he was simply thinking bigger about our family's prospects. Meanwhile, Dad's health was deteriorating faster than any of us wanted to admit. The decades of hard physical labor had taken their toll on his joints and his heart. His doctor recommended reducing his workload, but Dad resisted, insisting he needed to stay involved until both his sons were ready to take over completely. I threw myself into learning every aspect of the operation, from financial planning to equipment maintenance to crop rotation strategies. I enrolled in agricultural business courses at the community college and networked with other young farmers facing similar transitions. Everything I did was focused on preparing myself to be a worthy steward of the Henderson family legacy. Jake, however, seemed increasingly distracted and secretive. Phone calls would stop abruptly when I entered the room. Documents would disappear from Dad's desk, only to reappear filed away in places where Dad never would have put them. When I asked Jake about these inconsistencies, he accused me of being paranoid and suggested I focus on my own responsibilities instead of micromanaging his activities. The tension between us grew week by week, though Dad seemed oblivious to it. Probably because Jake was careful to maintain his charming facade whenever our father was around. Dad's heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning in October. One moment he was checking the combines before harvest. The next he was clutching his chest and collapsing onto the dirt road between the barn and the house. Jake and I rushed him to the county hospital, where the doctors worked frantically to stabilize his condition. For 3 weeks, Dad fought for his life in the intensive care unit. Jake and I took turns sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, talking to him about the farm, and sharing memories from our childhood. The doctors said he could hear us, even though he couldn't respond. So we filled those quiet hospital hours with stories about the land he loved. During one of my night shifts at the hospital, Dad briefly regained consciousness. His voice was weak and raspy, but his words were clear. "The papers," he whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Make sure the papers are right." I assumed he was talking about his will or the farm's financial documents, so I assured him everything was properly organized and legally documented. He seemed to relax after that, though I noticed his eyes held a worry that went beyond concern about paperwork. Jake was notably absent during Dad's few moments of consciousness, claiming he was handling urgent business matters that couldn't wait. When I pressed him for details, he said he was meeting with lawyers and accountants to ensure the farm's transition would be smooth after Dad's recovery. But Dad never recovered. He passed away peacefully on a Friday evening, with both Jake and me at his bedside. His last words were about the farm, about how proud he was of the land we'd preserved and the legacy we'd continue. At the funeral, neighbors and fellow farmers spoke about Dad's integrity, his commitment to sustainable agriculture, and his love for the land that had shaped our family's identity for over a century. 3 days after the funeral, we met with Dad's longtime attorney, Harold Weiss, in his cluttered office above the hardware store in downtown Henderson. Harold had prepared the wills for 3 generations of our family, and I expected this meeting to be a formality. A simple confirmation that Jake and I would inherit equal shares of the farm. Harold's expression was troubled as he shuffled through the documents on his desk. He kept glancing between Jake and me with an odd mixture of confusion and concern. "Boys," he began slowly, "I need to ask you something before we proceed. Did your father make any changes to his estate planning in the past 6 months?" Jake and I looked at each other. I shook my head, but Jake remained silent. "Why do you ask?" I said. Harold pulled out a folder marked with our father's name. "Because the will I have here is different from what we discussed when your father last visited my office 2 years ago." He opened the folder and spread several documents across his desk. "According to these papers, dated 6 months ago and bearing your father's signature, Jake inherits the entire farm. You, Michael, receive a cash settlement of $50,000. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the documents, reading the same devastating sentence over and over. "That can't be right," I said. "Dad would never." "We talked about this. He always said the farm would be split equally." Harold nodded sympathetically. "That's exactly what he told me 2 years ago. But this revised will is properly witnessed and notarized. It appears to be legally binding." I looked at Jake, expecting to see the same shock and confusion I felt. Instead, his expression was carefully neutral, almost resigned. "Jake," I said, "did you know about this?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Dad made his decision, Michael. We have to respect that." Something in his tone made my stomach turn. This wasn't the reaction of someone who'd been surprised by an unexpected inheritance. That evening, I sat alone in the farmhouse kitchen, staring at the copy of the will Harold had given me. The document looked legitimate. Dad's signature matched other papers I'd seen him sign, and the witnesses were people I recognized from town. But something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire situation. I called our family's accountant, Rebecca Martinez, who had been managing the farm's finances for the past decade. Rebecca was surprised to hear from me so soon after the funeral, but she agreed to meet the next morning to review the estate's financial situation. When I arrived at her office, Rebecca's expression was troubled. She had spreadsheets and bank statements spread across her conference table, and it was clear she'd been working late into the night trying to make sense of what she'd discovered. "Michael," she said carefully, "I need to show you something that doesn't make sense." She pointed to a series of transactions dating back 6 months, the same time frame when the new will had allegedly been signed. Large sums of money had been moved between accounts, and several properties that I didn't recognize had been purchased and then quickly sold. "These transactions weren't authorized by your father," Rebecca explained. "The signatures on the bank documents don't match his handwriting from previous years. And look at this. Someone took out a line of credit against the farm's equity without your father's knowledge." The evidence was overwhelming. Someone had been systematically manipulating Dad's finances and legal documents, and that someone had access to confidential information that only family members would possess. I thought about Jake's secretive phone calls, his expensive new clothes, his mysterious business meetings. The puzzle pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see. "Rebecca," I said, "I think my brother has been stealing from my father." I confronted Jake that evening in the barn where we'd worked together as children. He was going through Dad's tools, boxing up items with an efficiency that suggested he'd been planning this moment for months. "We need to talk," I said, blocking the doorway so he couldn't leave. Jake didn't look up from his packing. "About what?" "About the $50,000 missing from Dad's accounts. About the forged signatures on the bank documents. About the will that mysteriously appeared 6 months ago." Now Jake stopped what he was doing and faced me directly. For the first time since Dad's death, I saw a flash of the brother I used to know. angry, defensive, but also frightened. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I know you've been stealing from our father. I know you forged his signature on financial documents, and I'm pretty sure you forged his signature on that will too." Jake's laugh was bitter and cold. "Prove it." "I don't have to prove it. Dad's accountant already has enough evidence to involve the police. The only question is whether I report you or whether you come clean and we figure out how to fix this mess." For a moment, Jake's composure cracked. I saw fear in his eyes, followed quickly by resignation. "You want to know the truth, Michael? Fine. Dad was never going to leave you anything anyway. He was disappointed in you. Thought you were too soft, too sentimental about this place. He told me privately that he was planning to leave the entire farm to me. That's a lie." "Is it? Think about it. When did Dad ever praise your work? When did he ever ask for your opinion about major decisions? You were his backup plan, not his heir." The words stung because there was just enough truth in them to create doubt. Dad had always been more critical of my work than Jake's, and he'd rarely included me in conversations about the farm's long-term future. But I knew this was exactly the kind of manipulation Jake had always been skilled at, mixing truth with lies to create confusion and self-doubt. Over the next few days, I worked with Rebecca to trace the full extent of Jake's deception. What we discovered was far worse than simple theft. It was a systematic dismantling of everything our family had built over 4 generations. Jake hadn't just stolen money from Dad's accounts. He'd also mortgaged portions of the farm to fund his lifestyle and his gambling debts. The business meetings he'd been attending were actually poker games and trips to the casino in Council Bluffs. The expensive clothes and restaurant bills were funded by money that should have been used for equipment maintenance and seed purchases. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Rebecca found evidence that Jake had been in contact with Midwest Agricultural Development Corporation, a company that specialized in purchasing family farms and converting them into commercial operations or residential developments. Email exchanges showed that Jake had been negotiating to sell the entire farm for months before Dad's death. "Michael," Rebecca said, her voice grave. "According to these documents, Jake signed a preliminary sales agreement 3 weeks ago. The sale is scheduled to close next month." I felt the world spinning around me. He can't sell the farm. The will gives him ownership, but there are family restrictions, aren't there? Legal protections? Rebecca shook her head. Those restrictions were removed in the revised will. If Jake's ownership is legitimate, he has complete authority to sell the property. That's when I understood the full scope of Jake's plan. He hadn't just stolen our inheritance. He'd positioned himself to destroy our family's legacy entirely. Once the farm was sold to developers, there would be no way to recover what we'd lost. I had less than 30 days to prove the will was fraudulent and stop the sale of the only home I'd ever known. I hired a forensic handwriting expert from Omaha to examine Dad's signature on the revised will. Dr. Patricia Summers was a retired FBI analyst who specialized in document fraud, and her reputation in legal circles was impeccable. Dr. Summers spent 3 days analyzing every signature Dad had made in the past 5 years. Bank documents, insurance forms, legal papers, even birthday cards. She compared pen pressure, letter formation, and dozens of subtle characteristics that forgers typically couldn't replicate perfectly. Her conclusion was unambiguous. "Mr. Henderson, the signature on this will was not written by your father. It's a skilled forgery, but there are at least 12 distinct differences from his authentic signature patterns." Armed with Dr. Summers' expert analysis, I returned to Harold Weiss's office to challenge the will's validity. Harold studied the forensic report carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This is extremely serious, Michael. If this will is fraudulent, we're looking at multiple felony charges: fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and possibly more. What do we do now? We file an emergency petition with the probate court to stop any asset transfers until this matter can be resolved. But I have to warn you, Jake could face criminal prosecution, and if he's already spent money from the estate, recovery might be impossible." As Harold prepared the legal paperwork, I struggled with conflicting emotions. Jake was still my brother, despite everything he'd done. The thought of him going to prison was almost as painful as losing the farm. But I also thought about great-grandfather Henderson clearing this land with his own hands, about generations of family members who'd sacrificed to preserve our legacy, and about the promises I'd made to Dad about being a worthy steward of what we'd inherited. Some things were more important than family loyalty, and the Henderson farm was one of them. The emergency probate hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the county courthouse. Judge Margaret Foster had overseen estate disputes for 20 years, and her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for fraud. Jake arrived with an expensive attorney from Lincoln, a sharp-dressed man who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. Their strategy was immediately apparent, claimed that any irregularities in the will were the result of Dad's declining mental health, not deliberate fraud. "Your Honor," Jake's attorney began, "my client's father was suffering from early-stage dementia in his final months. It's entirely possible that Thomas Henderson signed documents without fully understanding their contents, or that his handwriting had deteriorated due to his medical condition." It was a clever defense, but I was prepared for it. Dr. Summers had anticipated this argument and had examined medical records showing that Dad's cognitive function was normal until his final heart attack. More importantly, I had witnesses who could testify about Dad's mental clarity during his last weeks of life. Harold presented our evidence methodically: the forensic analysis, the financial discrepancies, the timeline of suspicious transactions. He also called Rebecca Martinez to testify about the unauthorized bank activities and the missing funds. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source: Sarah Mitchell, the notary who had allegedly witnessed Dad's signature on the fraudulent will. "I never notarized any document for Thomas Henderson in the past year," Sarah testified. "Mr. Henderson always came to my office for notarizations, and I would have remembered seeing him. The signature on this notary seal is a forgery." Jake's attorney tried to create doubt about the technical aspects of the forensic analysis, but Judge Foster was clearly convinced by the weight of evidence. "Based on the testimony and evidence presented," Judge Foster announced, "I find probable cause to believe that the revised will dated 6 months ago is fraudulent. All asset transfers are hereby frozen, pending a full criminal investigation." Jake's face remained impassive, but I could see the defeat in his eyes. Chapter 10. The truth comes out. Following Judge Foster's ruling, the County Sheriff's Department launched a formal investigation into Jake's activities. Detective Ray Kowalski, who specialized in financial crimes, uncovered a trail of deception that stretched back almost 2 years. Jake had been systematically stealing from Dad's accounts by forging checks and authorizing electronic transfers. He'd used the money to pay gambling debts that had grown beyond his ability to manage through legitimate means. When the debts became overwhelming, he'd contacted Midwest Agricultural Development Corporation about selling the farm. The revised will was part of an elaborate scheme to legitimize his theft and give him legal authority to complete the sale. Jake had studied Dad's handwriting for months, practicing the signature until he could reproduce it convincingly. He'd paid a crooked notary in Omaha to backdate the documents and provide false witnesses. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was the evidence of Dad's growing awareness of Jake's theft in his final weeks. Detective Kowalski found a hidden folder in Dad's bedroom containing photocopies of suspicious bank statements and a half-written letter to the county attorney requesting an investigation. Dad had known what Jake was doing. His dying words about making sure the papers are right weren't just concern about estate planning, they were a warning about his older son's betrayal. When confronted with overwhelming evidence, Jake finally confessed. In exchange for a plea agreement that would spare him the maximum prison sentence, he provided a complete account of his crimes and agreed to make restitution for the stolen funds. "I never meant for it to go this far," Jake told me during our last conversation before his sentencing. "It started with just borrowing money that I intended to pay back, but the gambling debts kept growing, and I couldn't stop. I wanted to forgive him, wanted to find some way to rebuild our relationship, but the damage was too extensive. Jake had betrayed not just me, but 4 generations of family history, and the memory of a father who'd trusted him with everything." Chapter 11. Rebuilding from the ashes. With the fraudulent will invalidated, Dad's original estate plan went into effect. Jake and I inherited equal shares of the farm, but Jake's portion would be held in trust to pay restitution for his crimes and cover his legal expenses. I became the sole operational owner of the Henderson family farm. The road to recovery was steep. Jake's unauthorized borrowing had left the operation deeply in debt, and months of neglect during Dad's final illness had taken a toll on the buildings and equipment. I spent the winter developing a business plan that would allow me to pay off the debts while maintaining the farm's viability. I sold some of the less productive acreage to reduce the debt burden, a decision that would have broken Dad's heart, but was necessary for survival. I also took out a small business loan to purchase newer equipment and made partnerships with neighboring farmers to share expensive machinery costs. But the most important change was personal. Working the land alone, without Jake's help, but also without his manipulation and betrayal, I discovered a sense of purpose and peace that I'd never experienced before. Every sunrise brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to honor the legacy that 4 generations of Hendersons had built. Rebecca Martinez became more than just an accountant. She became a business partner who helped me navigate the complex financial recovery. Her daughter Maria, who was studying agricultural business at the University of Nebraska, began working part-time on the farm and showed a genuine interest in sustainable farming practices. Slowly, carefully, I began to rebuild not just the farm's finances, but also its reputation in the community. Neighbors who had heard about Jake's crimes rallied to support me, offering everything from equipment loans to emotional encouragement during the darkest moments. By the following spring, the Henderson farm was operating profitably again, and I had paid off most of the debt Jake had created. Chapter 12. A New Legacy. 5 years have passed since that devastating discovery in Harold Weiss's office. The Henderson farm is not only surviving but thriving under practices that honor both tradition and innovation. I've implemented sustainable farming techniques that improve soil health while maintaining profitability, and I've diversified our crops to include specialty grains for local restaurants and farmers markets. Jake was sentenced to 4 years in prison and is scheduled for release next month. He's written me several letters over the years, expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness. I've read every letter but haven't responded yet. Some wounds take longer to heal than others, and trust, once broken, requires time and demonstration to rebuild. The farm now employs 3 full-time workers and 2 part-time college students who are interested in learning modern farming techniques. Maria Martinez has become my business partner, bringing fresh ideas about marketing and technology that complement my understanding of the land itself. Last month, I married Sarah Thompson, a veterinarian who shares my love for rural life and my commitment to preserving agricultural traditions. We're expecting our first child in the spring, and I find myself thinking about the legacy I want to leave for the 5th generation of Hendersons who will call this land home. The farmhouse has been renovated and expanded, but I've kept Dad's old office exactly as he left it, complete with his farming journals and the family photographs that tell the story of our connection to this land. Sometimes I sit in his chair and read his notes about crop rotations and weather patterns, drawing wisdom from his decades of experience. I've learned that inheritance isn't just about money or property. It's about values, traditions, and the responsibility to preserve something meaningful for future generations. Jake tried to steal our material inheritance, but he couldn't touch the deeper legacy that Dad passed on to me. A love for the land, a commitment to hard work, and an understanding that true wealth comes from building something lasting. The Henderson farm will continue to thrive long after I'm gone, not because of what I inherited, but because of what I chose to do with that inheritance. Thank you for listening to this deeply personal story about family, betrayal, and the power of perseverance. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest challenges in life come from the people we trust most, but also that we have the strength to overcome even the most devastating betrayals when we stay true to our values. I'd love to hear from you. Please tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will inspire and move you. Your support means everything to us, and every subscription helps us continue sharing these powerful stories about the resilience of the human spirit.